Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartia and welcome to another episode of CISO Insights. And today we have with us once again Steve Winterfeld, Advisory CISO at Akamai. Steve, it's great to have you back on the show.
Always good to have a chance to chat with you.
Whenever there's a major story about some breach or compromise or attack, in most cases we learn that these breaches are from known issues or simple human error or mistakes like password reuse. Why are there still issues with the basics of cybersecurity?
It's interesting. There's a couple things we'll talk about today, but I'll start off with the concept of, just do the basics first. And on some aspects, that's very true. But the reality is it's such a complex environment today. So, when you're talking about the basics, I've got, my employees that are facing social engineering attacks. It might be a phishing email. It might be social media attacks. It may be, somebody calling them up, calling the call center and trying to talk their way into getting a password reset. And so, that there's a whole training aspect. There's a whole, how do I, Steve Winterfeld, I get an email. Hey, Steve, I saw on your social media that you're really into disc golf. We have a free promotion to give you this disc golf frisbee. So click on this website. We'll send you a frisbee to go play frisbee golf. Well, I'm going to click on that because I don't realize there's security implications. So that's one aspect. The next is supply chain. I buy some capability. It's inside my network. I'm using it. And then they have a vulnerability. Well, so now I have a new security control where I would need something like segmentation and something radically different than the social engineering protections. And then I have somebody who's an insider threat who may be, stealing information before they leave to go to another company. They may be, doing something malicious because they're disgruntled. So that's a different set of controls. And then I have those direct attacks for a 0 day or something that needs to be patched. And that would need something like a web application firewall, depending on where the vulnerability was. And so when you say the basics, because, is it a website versus an app? Is it a data center versus multi-cloud? Is it somebody on my infrastructure or bring your own device? And so I'm not sure it's really fair to say do the basics. That said, there are some fundamental things, MFA or segmentation or some things that I think we can say are basic.
And if I may ask you, how should organizations look at these basics? How should they train their employees so they have a security first approach?
It's interesting, how do I train somebody to think about security first? How do I change their mindset to be suspicious? It really is a challenge because I don't want them to be closed off and suspicious because that interferes with their productivity. But at the same time, I need them to use common sense and ask, does this sound right? Should I be getting this link from an external site? So the first is building a culture of security, having security champions, having staff that understands that clicking on something is a risk to our infrastructure. And so that's the first side. And then we get into, staffing itself. Do I have enough on the security staff? Do I have the right skill sets? One of the great examples here is a system called OWASP. And OWASP is a set of vulnerabilities for web applications. They've done another set of common vulnerabilities for APIs. They recently came up with a set of vulnerability for large language or generative AI access. And so, if broken auth is an API attack that happens all the time, we can fix that in our coding. And yet it is the most common attack we see is these authentication attacks. And so part of this does go back to training. It goes back to that culture of security. doing the coding right, minimizing the vulnerabilities up front, and then providing technical controls to reinforce that. Is there, I talked about me clicking to get a disk. Is there a DNS firewall to prevent me from going out to a malicious website? Is there a code review, or is there some kind of API security that identifies that I have a vulnerability and at the same time stops those kind of attacks from coming in? So I think there is a blend of culture, training, and technology here. And you have to get all three of those right to have a holistic security program.
And how would you categorize these things? Are they technical issues, staffing issues, cultural issues, or training issues?
I think, for me, a lot of this, I'm very much a process CISO. I live and breathe processes because that's what allows me to deal with the scale and complexity of this. So for me, a lot of this comes down to having integration to make sure that the culture and the coding is reinforced by the technical controls.
And as organizations or teams kind of improve their cyber hygiene, is there any baseline for them to understand when it comes to terms like cyber hygiene, the basics of cybersecurity, fundamentals of cybersecurity, or cyber return on investment?
Yeah, and so again, it's easy to throw this. We need to do the basics, but how do you set a baseline? How do you determine what the basics are? So I'll group this into a few things. The first is frameworks. I like to go out and NIST has just came out with NIST 2.0, there's got a lot of things, NIST 800 series that tell you different things you can implement. So there's a NIST zero trust architecture. You can go leverage that as a baseline for how to implement something. There's another one out there, more international, since NIST is very North America focused. ISO 2700, again, a checklist of if you do these things, these are kind of the basis of what we would expect to be done in a good program. There's an audit standard of COBIT. So you can go out and you can grab these frameworks and build your program around something like that. The next is there are great guides out there. I mentioned OWASP earlier. You could go pull OWASP in and say, listen, these are the basic coding things we need to get right. MITRE ATT&CK framework. These are the 14 steps that a hacker has to get through to break into our systems. Let's make sure we have security controls in each one of these so we have holistic control. That's another way to kind of say, okay, I have the basics built across this entire attack chain. You can go reference something like the Cloud Security Alliance. They've got, if you're very cloud focused, that's an external guide that's going to give you an approach to follow. I'm a little hesitant to build those into our policy because if you do get breached and are in a class action lawsuit, you don't want to necessarily be held to everything in there because not everything in there might imply to your infrastructure or to your most risk or the way you think about your value proposition. And then the last is if you're in a regulated industry, if you're in energy, you need to do the NERC SIP. If you have credit cards, you need to follow PCI. If you're in healthcare, you need to follow HIPAA or the implementation guide for HIPAA High Trust. If you're in cloud, maybe something like FedRAMP. So there are regulations. When I talk about regulations, I personally think the right way to go is build a security program that is compliant by default. Don't build a compliant program. So that's just kind of a thought process. But those are some great references you can go leverage to build out your basics.
Can you also talk about what is the right approach for organizations to build some of these practices? How do they get started?
We think about this, for me, the first is to understand where the risks are. Is if we have a lot of code out there, and I want to do the basics around code. The first comes to what are my coding practices, and then what guardrails do I build around that infrastructure that makes it easy for them to be secure. If it is internet facing, which it would be, versus maybe an app which is not internet facing, but something somebody might have on their mobile device. But how am I building that hook in so they can have a web application firewall or an API security infrastructure in front of that without having to do a lot of steps? If I require auditing, how can they hook into a set of auditing capabilities rather than get frustrated, with me giving them a requirement and not an easy way to do it? And so in that code environment, I need to make it easy to be secure. If I say I don't want them to make those OWASP mistakes, not only do I have to train them in what is the coding mistake they need to avoid, I need to do both process and runtime checking of saying, listen, you've got a business logic error over here, or you have a broken auth error over here. I'm going to do validation checking. So I think it is both make sure they can be successful, train them, make sure it's easy to be secure, and then validate that they're secure in those coding environments.
I mean, this is really not that easy to answer, but how many organizations do you see are already doing it, or you would prefer more and more organizations embrace these practices?
It's interesting you say that, because a lot of this is around transformation. And we're constantly doing this balance. I, as a CISO, I have tech debt. So I have things that I know I need to fix. And then I have transformation, where our business is headed, where our future of our business is, and I need to secure the future of our business. So how do I balance that? How do I make sure that compliance is baked into this transformation, so I'm not bolting compliance on afterwards? And so the first is really kind of being plugged into what's happening, and making sure that we understand, okay, if I have tech debt here, can I get rid of that infrastructure? Can I accept that risk? How am I dealing with that? And then I probably need some kind of a formal risk register where I've accepted that risk. And then moving forward, I should be thinking about, okay, as I do transformation here, this really is the future. This is where I want to invest more of my security, so I don't end up with tech debt in the middle of transformation, or trying to bolt security on afterwards, which is usually more expensive and less effective. So it is that constant balance, and that all comes through visibility and being plugged into what is important to the future of our business.
Now, when it comes to building these processes and practices, sometimes one area of expertise is tied to one team member. Now, those team members can leave the company. They take the tribal knowledge with them. It can lead to technical debt. So can you also talk about how do organizations maintain a balance among things like tribal knowledge, technical debt, transformation, and compliance demands, so that things are not tied to an individual or a specific team?
We have people, processes, and technology. And as I said, I tend to lean into processes, but processes have a risk. If processes become bureaucracy, then they're not helpful. If processes make us more effective and efficient, then they're perfect. Processes also can, avoid the hero problem. If that system's down, well, you need to call Brent, because Brent's the only one that knows how to fix that. Well, that's not a good day, because if Brent wins the lottery, then we can't fix that anymore. So, I think there are benefits to it, but it has to be done in a way that you can continue to be agile. And as we talk about compliance and we enter new compliance requirements, we want to do that in a way that allows us to have compliance as a byproduct, not a driver. And so if the regulation is for API security, something like the new PCI requires, security in a JavaScript environment, security around APIs. As I look at that as a CISO, I want to do that in a way that we set it up. It is a process that makes it easy to implement, hook into this API protection, hook into this JavaScript protection, and then it is not getting in the way of that agility. It is not getting in the way of the speed of our business.
And also, since we're talking balance, how do they also maintain a balance between stable, trusted technologies at the same time they can continue to explore new technologies, because we live in a world where a lot of new emerging technologies are coming, so that they can have something stable, but they can also play with something new without compromising with security and compliance?
I think we have two new things coming up. The first is the business. The business wants to leverage something that's new. Large language models, generative AI has been the big shiny object this year. In Akamai, we have members of the sales team that want to use it. We have our Zero Trust platform that wants to leverage that to do natural language queries for people that are using the Zero Trust platform. So on both sides, we have a lot of people moving towards that. And I think the key here is going back to what we said earlier. First of all, training people to understand the risk, training people on how to write good prompts, training people to understand that, if we're going to leverage it internally, here's a OWASP, large language model risk that we need to make sure when we build this into our capabilities is done correctly. And then that second part is building that culture of, okay, if I'm going out to this public AI capability, what is appropriate for me to ask it? I shouldn't be putting proprietary code out there, but it's fine for me to go check a sales email. So what is an appropriate risk to use out there? And a lot of that is around education. So I think all of this comes back to going back to the fundamentals.
I mean, if you look at this word, we would assume, just like a lot of other industries, of course, this is no comparison here. I'm looking at analog versus digital. Cars or airlines, they have solved most of their security related problems. We are not talking about airbags or brakes in cars today. So same thing when we look at the software tech world, that by now security should have been a solved problem. What mistake do you see organizations still continue to make where we are continuing to having these kind of discussions?
I think a lot of this goes back to, we're faced with such a complex environment that on any given day, I'm focused on an aspect of the environment. Today I'm focused on this aspect over here where we're moving into edge compute. So how do I secure edge compute? And then, a couple days later, I'm focused on this, we want to bring in this new vendor. So now I'm focused on just this security of vendor management. And we're spending so much time on very specific threats that we don't often sit back and say, okay, what are the basics? For instance, am I regulated? What are the basics of that regulation? And how do I kind of map over to make sure these new compliance requirements in here? Is there a culture aspect to this that I need to focus on? Training, let's take that classic passwords. How do I make sure that I have a culture of security rather than just this very specific threat? What is my overall framework? We mentioned, I'll just pick Zero Trust because we mentioned that earlier. If Zero Trust is a larger framework, then when I have the new vendor, when I have this, new capability over here, then I'm going back to, okay, zero trust is about access and it's about segmentation. So how do I make sure that I apply those two principles to these two problems? Am I leveraging those, again, for these two problems, do framework like MITRE or OWASP apply? If I keep going back to those fundamentals I use, then I'm doing them uniformly across all my problems. And finally, I think, that cyber risk and register and the cyber return on investment, if I'm asking myself those questions more often, then I'm being more consistent. And that brings me back to having the fundamentals done right in my mind. And again, I'm not trying to make this sound easy. This is not easy. But those are some of the things I do to try to get ahead of this curve.
Steve, thank you so much. I really appreciate these great insights today. And as usual, I look forward to our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks for the partnership. Have a great one.